10th of December, 1735. 1. Even though we buried Father today, the first thing I thought about when I awoke this morning didn't involve him or his funeral. It was about the plate room at Queen Anne's Square. They hadn't tried to enter it. Father had employed the 2 soldiers because he was worried about a robbery, but our attackers had made their way upstairs without even bothering to try to raid the plate room. Because they were after Jenny, that was why. And killing Father? Was that part of the plan? This was what I thought as I awoke to a room that was freezing, which isn't unusual that it should be freezing, an everyday occurrence, in fact. Just that today's room was especially cold. The kind of cold that sets your teeth on edge, that reaches into your bones. I glanced over to the hearth, wondering why there wasn't more heat from the fire, only to see that it was unlit and the grate grey and dusty with ash. I clambered out of bed and went to where there was a thick layer of ice on the inside of the window, preventing me from seeing out. Gasping with cold, I dressed, left my room, and was struck by how quiet the house seemed. Creeping all the way downstairs, I found Betty's room, knocked softly, then a little harder. When she didn't answer, I stood debating what to do, a little concern for her gnawing at the insides of my stomach. And when there was still no answer, I knelt to look through the keyhole, praying I wouldn't see anything I shouldn't. She lay asleep in one of the 2 beds in her room. The other one was empty and neatly made up, although there was a pair of what looked like men's boots at the foot of it, with a strip of silver at the heel. My gaze went back to Betty, and for a moment I watched as the blanket covering her rose and fell, and then decided to let her sleep on, and straightened. I ambled along to the kitchen, where Mrs. Searle started a little as I entered, looked me up and down with a slightly disapproving gaze, then returned to her work at the chopping board. It wasn't that Mrs. Searle and I had fallen out, just that Mrs. Searle regarded everybody with suspicion, and since the attack, even more so. "She's not one of life's most forgiving sorts," Betty had said to me one afternoon. And that was another thing that had changed since the attack. Betty had become a lot more candid, and every now and then would drop hints about how she really felt about things. I had never realized that she and Mrs. Searle didn't see eye to eye, for example, nor had I any idea that Betty regarded Mr. Birch with suspicion. She did, though. "I don't know why he's making decisions on behalf of the Kenways," she had muttered darkly yesterday. "He's not a member of the family. Doubt he ever will be." Somehow, knowing that Betty didn't think much of Mrs. Searle made the housekeeper less forbidding in my eyes, and while before I would have thought twice about wandering into the kitchen unannounced and requesting food, I now had no such qualms. "Good morning, Mrs. Searle," I said. She gave a small curtsy. The kitchen was cold, just her in it. At Queen Anne's Square, Mrs. Searle had at least 3 helpers, not to mention sundry other staff who flitted in and out through the great double doors of the kitchen. But that was before the attack, when we had a full complement, and there's nothing like an invasion of sword-wielding masked men for driving the servants away. Most hadn't even returned the following day. Now there was just Mrs. Searle, Betty, Mr. Digweed, a chambermaid called Emily, and Miss Davy, who was Mother's lady's maid. They were the last of the staff who looked after the Kenways. Or the remaining Kenways, I should say. Just me and Mother left now. When I left the kitchen it was with a piece of cake wrapped in cloth, handed to me with a sour look by Mrs. Searle, who no doubt disapproved of me wandering about the house so early in the morning, scavenging for food ahead of the breakfast she was in the process of preparing. I like Mrs. Searle, and since she's one of the few members of staff to have stayed with us after that terrible night, I like her even more. But even so, there are other things to worry about now. Father's funeral. And Mother, of course. And then I found myself in the entrance hall, looking at the inside of the front door, and before I knew it I was opening the door, and without thinking too much anyway, letting myself out onto the steps, and out into a world clouded with frost. 2. Now, what in the blazes do you plan to do on such a cold morning, Master Hightam? A carriage had just drawn up outside the house, and at the window was Mr. Birch. He wore a hat that was heavier than usual, and a scarf pulled up over his nose, so that at first glance he looked like a highwayman. "Just looking, sir," I said, from the steps. He pulled his scarf down, trying to smile. Before, when he'd smiled, it had set his eyes twinkling. Now it was like the dwindling, cooling ashes of the fire, trying but unable to generate any warmth, as strained and tired as his voice when he spoke. "I think perhaps I know what you're looking for, Master Hightam." "What's that, sir?" "The way home?" I thought about it and realized he was right. The trouble was, I had lived the first 10 years of my life being shepherded around by parents and the nursemaids. Though I knew that Queen Anne's Square was near, and even within walking distance, I had no idea how to get there. "And were you planning on a visit?" he asked. I shrugged, but the truth of it was that, yes, I had pictured myself in the shell of my old home. In the games room there, I'd pictured myself retrieving— "Your sword?" I nodded. "It's too dangerous to go in the house, I'm afraid. Would you like to take a trip over there anyway? You can see it, at least. Come inside. It's as cold as a greyhound's nostril out there." And I saw no reason not to, especially when he produced a hat and a cape from within the depths of the carriage. When we pulled up at the house some moments later, it didn't look at all as I had imagined it. No, it was far, far worse. As though a giant godlike fist had pounded into it from above, smashing through the roof and the floors beneath, gouging a huge, ragged hole into the house. It wasn't so much a house now as a cutaway of one. Through broken windows we could see into the entrance hall and up, through smashed floors to the hallway 3 flights up, all of them blackened with soot. I could see furniture that I recognized, blackened and charred, burnt portraits hanging lopsided on the walls. "I'm sorry. It really is too dangerous to go inside, Master Hightam," said Mr. Birch. After a moment he led me back into the carriage, tapped the ceiling twice with his cane, and we pulled away. "However," said Mr. Birch, "I took the liberty of retrieving your sword yesterday." And reaching beneath his seat, he produced the box. It, too, was dusty with soot, but when he pulled it to his lap and opened the lid, the sword lay inside, as gleaming as it had been the day Father gave it to me. "Thank you, Mr. Birch," was all I could say, as he closed the box and placed it on the seat between us. "It's a handsome sword, Hightam. I've no doubt you'll treasure it." "I will, sir." "And when, I wonder, will it first taste blood?" "I don't know, sir." There was a pause. Mr. Birch clasped his cane between his knees. "The night of the attack," You killed a man, he said, turning his head to look out of the window. We passed houses that were only just visible, floating through a haze of smoke and freezing air. It was still early. The streets were quiet. How did that feel, Hightam? I was protecting Mother, I said. That was the only possible option, Hightam, he agreed, nodding. And you did the right thing. Don't for a moment think otherwise. But it being the only option doesn't change the fact that it's no small matter to kill a man. For anybody. Not for your father, not for me. But especially not for a boy of such tender years. I felt no sadness at what I did. I just acted. And have you thought about it since? No, sir. I've thought only of Father and Mother. And Jenny? Said Mr. Birch. Oh, yes, sir. There was a pause, and when he next spoke, his voice was flat and solemn. We need to find her, Hightam, he said. I kept quiet. I intend to leave for Europe, where we believe she is being held. How do you know she's in Europe, sir? Hightam, I am a member of an influential and important organization. A kind of club or society. One of the many advantages to membership is that we have eyes and ears everywhere. What is it called, sir? I asked. The Templars, Master Hightam. I am a Templar knight. A knight, I said, looking at him sharply. He gave a short laugh. Perhaps not exactly the kind of knight you're thinking of, Hightam, a relic of the Middle Ages, but our ideals remain the same. Just as our forebears set out to spread peace across the Holy Land centuries ago, so we are the unseen power that helps to maintain peace and order in our time. He waved his hand at the window, where the streets were busier now. All of this, Hightam, it requires structure and discipline, and structure and discipline require an example to follow. The Knights Templar are that example. My head span. And where do you meet? What do you do? Do you have armor? Later, Hightam. Later I'll tell you more. Was Father a member, though? Was he a knight? My heart leapt. Was he training me to become one? No, Master Hightam, he was not. And I'm afraid that as far as I'm aware, he was merely training you in swordsmanship in order that... Well, the fact that your mother lives proves the worth of your lessons. No, my relationship with your father was not built on my membership of the Order. I'm pleased to say that I was employed by him for my skill at property management rather than any hidden connections. Nevertheless, he knew that I was a knight. After all, the Templars have powerful and wealthy connections, and these could sometimes be of use in our business. Your father may not have been a member, but he was shrewd enough to see the worth of the connections. A friendly word, the passing on of useful information. He took a deep breath. One of which was the tip-off about the attack at Queen Anne's Square. I told him, of course. I asked him why it might be that he had been targeted, but he scoffed at the very idea. Disingenuously, perhaps. We clashed over it, Hightam. Voices were raised. But I only wish now I'd been even more insistent. Was that the argument I heard? I asked. He looked sideways at me. So you did hear, did you? Not eavesdropping, I hope. The tone in his voice made me more than thankful I hadn't been. No, Mr. Birch, sir. I heard raised voices, and that was all. He looked hard at me. Satisfied I was telling the truth, he faced forward. Your father was as stubborn as he was inscrutable. But he didn't ignore the warning, sir. He employed the soldiers after all. Mr. Birch sighed. Your father didn't take the threat seriously, and would have done nothing. When he wouldn't listen to me, I took the step of informing your mother. It was at her insistence that he employed the soldiers. I wish now I had substituted the men from our ranks. They would not have been so easily overwhelmed. All I can do now is try to find his daughter for him, and punish those responsible. To do that, I need to know why. What was the purpose of the attack? Tell me, what do you know of him before he settled in London, Master Hightam? Nothing, sir, I replied. He gave a dry chuckle. Well, that makes two of us. More than two of us, in fact. Your mother knows next to nothing also. And Jenny, sir? Ah, the equally inscrutable Jenny. As frustrating as she was beautiful, as inscrutable as she was adorable. Was, sir? A turn of phrase, Master Hightam. I hope with all my heart, at least. I remain hopeful that Jenny is safe in the hands of her captors, of use to them only if she is alive. You think she has been taken for a ransom? Your father was very rich. Your family might well have been targeted for your wealth, and your father's death unplanned. It's certainly possible. We have men looking into that possibility now. Equally, the mission may have been to assassinate your father, and we have men looking into that possibility also. Well, me, because of course I knew him well, and would know if he had any enemies. Enemies with the wherewithal to stage such an attack, I mean, rather than disgruntled tenants. And I came up with not a single possibility, which leads me to believe that the object may have been to settle a grudge. If so, then it's a long-standing grudge, something that relates to his time before London. Jenny, being the only one who knew him before London, may have had answers, but whatever she knew she has taken into the hands of her captors. Either way, Hightam, we need to locate her. There was something about the way he said, we. As I say, it is thought she will have been taken somewhere in Europe. So Europe is where we will conduct our search for her, and by we, I mean you and me, Hightam. I started. Sir? I said, hardly able to believe my ears. That's right, he said. You shall be coming with me. Mother needs me, sir. I can't leave her here. Mr. Birch looked at me again, in his eyes neither kindliness nor malice. Hightam, he said, I'm afraid the decision is not yours to make. It is for Mother to make, I insisted. Well, quite. What do you mean, sir? He sighed. I mean, have you spoken to your mother since the night of the attack? She's been too distressed to see anyone but Miss Davy or Emily. She stayed in her room, and Miss Davy says I'm to be summoned when she can see me. When you do see her, you will find her changed. Sir? On the night of the attack, Tessa saw her husband die, and her little boy kill a man. These things will have had a profound effect on her, Hightam. She may not be the person you remember. All the more reason she needs me. Maybe what she needs is to get well, Hightam. Possibly with as few reminders of that terrible night around her as possible. I understand, sir, I said. I'm sorry if that comes as a shock, Hightam. He frowned. And I may well be wrong, of course. But I've been dealing with your father's business affairs since his death, and we've been making arrangements with your mother. I've had the opportunity of seeing her firsthand, and I don't think I'm wrong. Not this time. 3. Mother called for me shortly before the funeral. When Betty, who had been full of red-faced apologies for what she called her little lie-in, told me, my first thought was that she had changed her mind about me going to Europe with Mr. Birch. But I was wrong. Darting along to her room, I knocked and only just heard her tell me to come in, her voice so weak and reedy now, not at all how it used to be, when it was soft but commanding. Inside she was sitting by the window, and Miss Davy was fussing at the curtains. Even though it was daytime, it was hardly bright outside, but nevertheless, Mother was waving her hand in front of her, as if she were being bothered by an angry bird, rather than just some greying rays of winter sunlight. At last Miss Davy finished to Mother's satisfaction, and with a weary smile indicated me to a seat. Mother turned her head towards me very slowly, looked at me, and forced a smile. The attack had exacted a terrible toll on her. It was as though all the life had been leached out of her, as though she had lost the light she always had, whether she was smiling or cross or, as Father always said, wearing her heart on her sleeve. Now the smile slowly slid from her lips, which settled back into a blank frown, as though she tried but no longer had the strength to keep up any pretense. "You know I'm not going to the funeral, Hightam," she said blankly. "Yes, Mother. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Hightam, I really am. But I'm not strong enough." She never usually called me Hightam. She called me darling. "Yes, Mother," I said, knowing that she was. She was strong enough. "Your mother has more pluck than any man I've ever met, Hightam," Father used to say. They had met shortly after they moved to London, and she had pursued him. Like a lioness in pursuit of her prey, Father had joked, a sight as blood-curdling as it was awe-inspiring, and earned himself a clout for that particular joke, the kind of joke you thought might have had an element of truth to it. She didn't like to talk about her family. Well-to-do was all I knew. And Jenny had hinted once that they had disowned her because of her association with Father. Why, of course, I never found out. On the odd occasion I'd pestered Mother about Father's life before London, she'd smiled mysteriously. He'd tell me when he was ready. Sitting in her room, I realized that at least part of the grief I felt was the pain of knowing that I'd never hear whatever it was Father was planning to tell me on my birthday. Although it's just a tiny part of the grief, I should make clear, insignificant compared to the grief of losing Father and the pain of seeing Mother like this, so reduced, so lacking in that pluck Father spoke of. Perhaps it had turned out that the source of her strength was him. Perhaps the carnage of that terrible evening had simply been too much for her to take. They say it happens to soldiers. They get soldiers' heart and become shadows of their former selves. The bloodshed changes them somehow. Was that the case with Mother, I wondered? "I'm sorry, Hightam," she added. "It's all right, Mother." No, I mean you are to go to Europe with Mr. Birch. But I'm needed here, with you, to look after you." She gave an airy laugh. "Mamma's little soldier, huh?" And fixed me with a strange, searching look. I knew exactly where her mind was going. Back to what had happened on the stairs. She was seeing me thrust a blade into the eye socket of the masked attacker. And then she tore her eyes away, leaving me feeling almost breathless with the raw emotion of her gaze. "I have Miss Davy and Emily to look after me, Hightam. When the repairs are made to Queen Anne's Square, we'll be able to move back and I can employ more staff. No, it is me who should be looking after you. And I have appointed Mr. Birch the family comptroller and your guardian, so that you can be looked after properly. It's what your father would have wanted." She looked at the curtain quizzically, as if she was trying to recall why it was drawn. "I understand Mr. Birch was going to speak to you about leaving for Europe straight away." "He did, yes, but good." She regarded me. Again, there was something discomforting about the look. She was no longer the mother I knew, I realized. Or was I no longer the son she knew? "It's for the best, Hightam." "But, Mother—" She looked at me, then away again quickly. "You're going, and that's the end of it," she said firmly, her stare returning to the curtains. My eyes went to Miss Davy as though looking for assistance, but I found none. In return she gave me a sympathetic smile, a raise of the eyebrows, an expression that said, "I'm sorry, Hightam, there's nothing I can do, her mind is made up." And there was silence in the room. No sound apart from the clip-clopping of hooves from outside, from a world that carried on oblivious to the fact that mine was being taken apart. "You are dismissed, Hightam," Mother said, with a wave of her hand. Before the attack, I mean, she had never used to summon me, or dismiss me. Before, she had never let me leave her side without at least a kiss on the cheek, and she'd told me she loved me at least once a day. As I stood, it occurred to me that she hadn't said anything about what had happened on the stairs that night. She had never thanked me for saving her life. At the door I paused and turned to look at her, and wondered whether she wished the outcome had been different. 4. Mr. Birch accompanied me to the funeral, a small, informal service at the same chapel we had used for Edith, with almost the same number in attendance. The household, old Mr. Failing, and a few members of staff from Father's work, whom Mr. Birch spoke to afterwards. He introduced me to one of them, Mr. Simpkin, a man I judged to be in his mid-30s, who I was told would be handling the family's affairs. He bowed a little and gave me a look I'm coming to recognize as a mixture of awkwardness and sympathy, each struggling to find adequate expression. "I will be dealing with your mother while you are in Europe, Master Hightam," he assured me. It hit me that I really was going, that I had no choice, no say whatsoever in the matter. Well, I do have a choice, I suppose. I could run away. Not that running away seemed like any kind of choice. We took carriages home. Trooping into the house, I caught sight of Betty, who looked at me and gave me a weak smile. The news about me was spreading, so it seemed. When I asked her what she planned to do, she told me that Mr. Digweed had found her alternative employment. When she looked at me, her eyes shone with tears. And when she left the room, I sat at my desk to write my journal with a heavy heart. 11th of December, 1735. 1. We depart for Europe tomorrow morning. It strikes me how few preparations are needed. It is as though the fire had already severed all my ties with my old life. What few things I had left were only enough to fill 2 trunks, which were taken away this morning. Today I am to write letters, and also to see Mr. Birch in order to tell him about something that occurred last night, after I'd gone to bed. I was almost asleep when I heard a soft knocking at the door, sat up and said, "Come in," fully expecting it to be Betty. It wasn't. I saw the figure of a girl who stepped quickly into the room and shut the door behind her. She raised a candle so I could see her face and the finger she held to her lips. It was Emily, blonde-haired Emily, the chambermaid. "Master Hightam," she said, "I have something I need to tell you, which has been preying on my mind, sir." "Of course," I said, hoping my voice wouldn't betray the fact that I felt suddenly very young and vulnerable. "I know the maid of the Barretts," she said quickly. "Violet, who was one of those who came out of their houses that night. She was close to the carriage they put your sister in, sir. As they bundled Miss Jenny past her and the carriage, Miss Jenny caught Violet's eye and told her something quickly which Violet has told me." "What was it?" I said. "It was very quick, sir, and there was plenty of noise, and before she could say any more, they bundled her into the carriage. But what Violet thinks she heard was traitor. Next day, a man paid Violet a visit, a man with a West Country accent, or so she said, who wanted to know what she'd heard. But Violet said she'd heard nothing, even when the gentleman threatened her. He showed her an evil-looking knife, sir, out of his belt, but even then she said nothing." "But she told you?" "Violet's my sister, sir. She worries for me." "Have you told anyone else?" "No, sir." "I shall tell Mr. Birch in the morning," I said. "But, sir—" "What?" "What if the traitor is Mr. Birch?" I gave a short laugh and shook my head. "It isn't possible. He saved my life. He was there fighting the—" Something struck me. There is someone who wasn't there, though. 2. Of course I sent word to Mr. Birch at the first opportunity this morning, and he reached the same conclusion I had. An hour later, another man arrived, who was shown into the study. He was about the same age my father had been, and had a craggy face, scars, and the cold, staring eyes of some species of sea life. He was taller than Mr. Birch, and broader, and seemed to fill the room with his presence. A dark presence. And he looked at me. Down his nose at me. Down his wrinkled with disdain nose at me. "This is Mr. Braddock," said Mr. Birch, as I stood fixed into place by the newcomer's glare. "He is also a Templar. He has my total and utmost trust, Hightam." He cleared his throat and said loudly, "And a manner sometimes at odds with what I know to be in his heart." Mr. Braddock snorted and shot him a withering look. "Now, Edward," chided Birch. "Hightam, Mr. Braddock will be in charge of finding the traitor." "Thank you, sir," I said. Mr. Braddock looked me over, then spoke to Mr. Birch. "This Digweed," he said. "Perhaps you can show me his quarters." When I moved to follow them, Mr. Braddock glared at Mr. Birch, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned to me, smiling, with a look in his eyes that begged my forbearance. "Hi, Tam," he said. "Perhaps you should attend to other matters. Your preparations for leaving, perhaps." And I was compelled to return to my room, where I surveyed my already packed cases, then retrieved my journal in which to write the events of the day. Moments ago, Mr. Birch came to me with the news. "Digweed has escaped," he told me, his face grave. "However, they will find him," he assured me. "The Templars always catch their man, and in the meantime, nothing changes. We still depart for Europe. It strikes me this will be my last entry at home here in London. These are the last words of my old life, before my new one begins." Part 2. 1747. 12 years later. 10th of June, 1747. 1. I watched the traitor today as he moved around the bazaar. Wearing a plumed hat, colourful buckles and garters, he strutted from stall to stall and twinkled in the bright white Spanish sun. With some of the stall holders he joked and laughed. With others he exchanged cross words. He was neither friend nor despot, it seemed, and indeed the impression I formed of him, albeit one I formed at a distance, was of a fair man, benevolent even. But then again, it's not those people he was betraying. It is his order. It is us. His guards stayed with him during his rounds, and they were diligent men, I could tell. Their eyes never stopped moving around the market, and when one of the stall holders gave him a hearty clap on the back and pressed on him a gift of bread from his stall, he waved to the taller of the two guards, who took it with his left hand, keeping his sword hand free. Good. Good man. Templar trained. Moments later a small boy darted out from the crowds, and straight away my eyes went to the guards, saw them tense, assess the danger, and then relax? Laugh at themselves for being jumpy? No. They stayed tense. Stayed watchful, because they're not fools, and they knew the boy might have been a decoy. They were good men. I wondered if they had been corrupted by the teachings of their employer, a man who pledged allegiance to one cause while promoting the ideals of another. I hoped not, because I'd already decided to let them live. And if it appears to be somewhat convenient that I've decided to let them live, and that maybe the truth has more to do with my apprehension of going into combat with two such competent men, then that appearance is false. They may be vigilant. Undoubtedly they would be expert swordsmen. They would be skilled in the business of death. But then I am vigilant. I am an expert swordsman, and I am skilled in the business of death. I have a natural aptitude for it. Although unlike theology, philosophy, classics, and my languages, particularly Spanish, which is so good that I'm able to pass as a Spaniard here in Altea, albeit a somewhat reticent one, I take no pleasure in my skill at death. Simply, I am good at it. Perhaps if my target was Digweed, perhaps then I might take some small measure of gratification from his death at my hands. But it is not. 2. For the 5 years after we left London, Reginald and I scoured Europe, moving from country to country in a travelling caravan of staff and fellow knights who shifted around us, drifting in and out of our lives, we too the only constants, as we moved from one country to the next, sometimes picking up the trail of a group of Turkish slavers who were believed to be holding Jenny, and occasionally acting on information concerning Digweed, which Braddock would attend to, riding off for months on end, but always returning empty-handed. Reginald was my tutor, and in that respect he had similarities to father. First, in that he tended to sneer at almost anything from books, constantly asserting that there existed a higher, more advanced learning than could be found in dusty old schoolbooks, which I later came to know as Templar learning, and second, in that he insisted I think for myself. Where they differed was that my father would ask me to make up my own mind. Reginald, I came to learn, viewed the world in more absolute terms. With father, I sometimes felt as if the thinking was enough, that the thinking was a means unto itself, and the conclusion I reached somehow less important than the journey. With father, facts and, looking back over past journals, I realize even the entire concept of truth could feel like shifting, mutable properties. There was no such ambiguity with Reginald, though, and in the early years when I might say otherwise, he'd smile at me and tell me he could hear my father in me. He'd tell me how my father had been a great man and wise in many ways, and quite the best swordsman he had ever known, but his attitude to learning was not as scholarly as it might have been. Does it shame me to admit that over time I came to prefer Reginald's way? The stricter Templar way. And though he was always good-tempered, quick with a joke and smile, he lacked the natural joy, even mischief, of father. He was always buttoned and neat, for one thing, and he was fanatical about punctuality. He insisted that things be orderly at all times. And yet, almost despite myself, there was something fixed about Reginald, some certainty, both inner and outer, that came to appeal to me more and more as the years passed. One day I realized why. It was the absence of doubt, and with it confusion, indecision, uncertainty. This feeling of knowing that Reginald imbued in me, was my guide from boyhood to adulthood. I never forgot my father's teachings. On the contrary, he would have been proud of me because I questioned his ideals. In doing so, I adopted new ones. We never found Jenny. Over the years, I'd mellowed towards her memory. Reading back over my journals, the young me could not have cared less about her, something I'm somewhat ashamed of, because I'm a grown man now, and I see things in different terms. Not that my youthful antipathy towards her did anything to hinder the hunt for her, of course. In that mission, Mr. Birch had more than enough zeal for the two of us. But it wasn't enough. The funds we received from Mr. Simpkin in London were handsome, but they weren't without end. We found a chateau in France, hidden near Troyes, in the Landes of Champagne, in which to make our base, where Mr. Birch continued my apprenticeship, sponsoring my admittance as an adept, and then, 3 years ago, as a fully fledged member of the Order. Weeks would go by with no mention of either Jenny or Digweed. Then months. We were involved in other Templar activities. The War of the Austrian Succession had seemed to gobble the whole of Europe into its greedy maw, and we were needed to help protect Templar interests. My aptitude, my skill at death, became apparent, and Reginald was quick to see its benefits. The first to die, not my first kill, of course, my first assassination, I should say, was a greedy merchant in Liverpool. My second was an Austrian prince. After the killing of the merchant, 2 years ago, I returned to London, only to find that building work was continuing at Queen Anne's Square, and Mother was too tired to see me that day, and would be the following day as well. Is she too tired to answer my letters too? I asked Mrs. Davy, who apologized and averted her gaze. I asked Mrs. Davy, who apologized and averted her gaze. Afterwards I rode to Herefordshire, hoping to locate Digweed's family, to no avail. The traitor in our household was never to be found, it seemed. Or is never to be found, I should say. But then the fire of vengeance in my gut burns less fiercely these days. Perhaps simply because I've grown. Perhaps because of what Reginald has taught me about control of oneself, mastery of one's own emotions. Even so, dim it may be, but it continues to burn within me. 3. The hostel owner's wife has just been to visit, throwing a quick look down the steps before she closed the door behind her. A messenger arrived while I was out, she said, and handed his missive to me with a lascivious look that I might have been tempted to act upon, if I hadn't had other things on my mind. The events of last night, for example. So instead I ushered her out of my room and sat down to decode the message. It told me that as soon as I was finished in Altea, I was to travel not home, to France, but to Prague, where I would meet Reginald in the cellar rooms of the house in Chaletna Lane, the Templar headquarters. He has an urgent matter to discuss with me. In the meantime, I have my cheese. Tonight, the traitor meets his end. 11th of June, 1747. 1. It is done. The kill, I mean. And though it was not without its complications, the execution was clean, insofar as he is dead and I remain undetected, and for that I can allow myself to take a measure of satisfaction in having completed my task. His name was Juan Vedomir, and supposedly his job was to protect our interests in Altea. That he had used the opportunity to build an empire of his own was tolerated. The information we had was that he controlled the port and market with a benign hand, and certainly on the evidence of earlier that day he seemed to enjoy some support, even if the constant presence of his guards proved that wasn't always the case. Was he too benign, though? Reginald thought so, had investigated, and eventually found that Vedomir's abandonment of Templar ideologies was so complete as to amount to treachery. We are intolerant of traitors in the Order. I was dispatched to Altea. I watched him, and last night I took my cheese and left my hostel for the last time, making my way along cobbled streets to his villa. "Yes," said the guard who opened his door. "I have cheese," I said. "I can smell it from here," he replied. "I hope to convince Senor Vedomir to allow me to trade at the bazaar." His nose wrinkled some more. "Senor Vedomir is in the business of attracting patrons to the market, not driving them away." "Perhaps those with a more refined palate might disagree, Senor." The guard squinted. "Your accent. Where are you from?" He was the first to question my Spanish citizenship. "Originally from the Republic of Genoa," I said, smiling, "where cheese is one of our finest exports." "Your cheese will have to go a long way to beat Varela's cheese." I continued to smile. "I am confident that it does. I am confident that Senor Vedomir will think so." He looked doubtful, but stood aside and let me into a wide entrance hall, which, though the night was warm, was cool, almost cold, as well as being sparse, with just 2 chairs and a table, on which were some cards. I glanced at them. A game of piquet, I was pleased to see, because piquet is a 2-player game, which meant there were no more guards hiding in the woodwork. The first guard indicated for me to place the wrapped cheese on the card table, and I did as I was told. The second man stood back, one hand on the hilt of his sword, as his partner checked me for weapons, patting my clothes thoroughly, and next searching the bag I wore around my shoulder, in which were a few coins and my journal, but nothing more. I had no blade. "He's not armed," said the first guard, and the second man nodded. The first guard indicated my cheese. "You want Senor Vedomir to taste this, I take it?" I nodded enthusiastically. "Perhaps I should taste it first," said the first guard, watching me closely. "I had hoped to save it all for Senor Vedomir," I replied with an obsequious smile. The guard gave a snort. "You have more than enough. Perhaps you should taste it." I began to protest. "But I had hoped to save it for—" He put his hand to the hilt of his sword. "Taste it," he insisted. I nodded. "Of course, senor," I said, and unwrapped a piece, picked off a chunk and ate it. Next he indicated I should try another piece, which I did, making a face to show how heavenly it tasted. "And now that it's been opened," I said, proffering the wrapping, "you might as well have a taste." The two guards exchanged a look, then at last the first smiled, went to a thick wooden door at the end of the passageway, knocked and entered. Then they appeared again and beckoned me forward into Vedomir's chamber. Inside it was dark and heavily perfumed. Silk billowed gently on the low ceiling as we entered. Vedomir sat with his back to us, his long black hair loose, wearing a nightshirt and writing by the light of a candle at his desk. "Would you have me stay, Senor Vedomir?" asked the guard. Vedomir didn't turn around. "I take it our guest isn't armed?" "No, senor," said the guard, "although the smell of his cheese is enough to fell an army." "To me the scent is a perfume, Christian," laughed Vedomir. "Please show our guest to a seat, and I shall be over in a moment." I sat on a low stool by an empty hearth as he blotted the book, then came over, stopping to pick up a small knife from a side table as he came. "Cheese, then?" His smile split a thin moustache as he lifted his nightshirt to sit on another low stool opposite. "Yes, senor," I said. He looked at me. "Oh, I was told you were from the Republic of Genoa, but I can hear from your voice that you are English." I started with shock, but the big grin he wore told me I had nothing to worry about. Not yet, at least. "And there I was, thinking me so clever to hide my nationality all this time," I said, impressed. "But you have found me out, senor. And the first to do so, evidently, which is why your head is still on your shoulders. Our two countries are at war, are they not?" "The whole of Europe is at war, senor. I sometimes wonder if anybody knows who is fighting whom." Vedomir chuckled and his eyes danced. "You're being disingenuous, my friend. I think we all know your King George's allegiances, as well as his ambitions. Your British Navy is said to think itself the best in the world. The French, the Spanish, not to mention the Swedes, disagree. An Englishman in Spain takes his life in his hands. Should I be concerned for my safety now, senor? With me?" He spread his hands and gave a crooked, ironic smile. "I like to think I rise above the petty concerns of kings, my friend." "Then who do you serve, senor?" "Why, the people of the town, of course." "And to whom do you pledge allegiance, if not to King Ferdinand?" "To a higher power, senor," smiled Vedomir, closing the subject firmly and turning his attention to the wrappings of cheese I'd placed by the hearth. "Now," he went on, "you'll have to forgive my confusion. This cheese, is it from the Republic of Genoa, or is it English cheese?" "It is my cheese, senor. My cheeses are the best wherever one plants one's flag." "Good enough to usurp Varela?" "Perhaps to trade alongside him." And what then? Then I have an unhappy Varela. Yes, senor. Such a state of affairs might be of no concern to you, senor, but these are the matters that vex me daily. Now, let me taste this cheese before it melts, eh? Pretending to feel the heat, I loosened my neck scarf, then took it off. Surreptitiously, I reached into my shoulder bag and palmed a doubloon. When he turned his attention to the cheese, I dropped the doubloon into the scarf. The knife glittered in the candlelight as Vedomir cut off a chunk of the first cheese, holding the piece with his thumb and sniffing at it. Hardly necessary. I could smell it from where I sat. Then popped it into his mouth. He ate thoughtfully, looked at me, then cut off a second chunk. He said after some moments. You are wrong, senor. This is not superior to Varela's cheese. It is in fact exactly the same as Varela's cheese. His smile had faded, and his face had darkened. I realized I had been found out. In fact, this is Varela's cheese. His mouth was opening to shout for help as I dropped the doubloon into the scarf, twirled the silk into a garrote with a flick of my wrists, and leapt forward with crossed arms, dropping it over his head and around his neck. His knife hand arced up, but he was too slow and caught unawares, and the knife thrashed wildly at the silk above our heads as I secured my rumal, the coin pressing in on his windpipe, cutting off any noise. Holding the garrote with one hand, I disarmed him, tossed the knife to a cushion, then used both hands to tighten the rumal. My name is Hightam Kenway, I said dispassionately, leaning forward to look into his wide-open, bulging eyes. You have betrayed the Templar Order. For this, you have been sentenced to execution. His arm rose in a futile attempt to claw at my eyes, but I moved my head and watched the silk flutter gently as the life left him. When it was over, I carried his body to the bed, then went to his desk to take his journal, as I had been instructed. It was open, and my eye fell upon some writing. Para ver de manera diferente, primero debemos pensar diferente. I read it again, translating it carefully, as though I were learning a new language. To see differently, we must first think differently. I stared at it for some moments, deep in thought, then snapped the book shut and stowed it in my bag, returning my mind to the job at hand. Vedomir's death would not be discovered until morning, by which time I would be long gone, on my way to Prague, where I now had something to ask Reginald. 18th of June, 1747. 1. It's about your mother, Hightam. He stood before me in the basement of the headquarters on Chiletna Lane. He had made no effort to dress for Prague. He wore his Englishness like a badge of honour, neat and tidy white stockings, black breeches, and of course his wig, which was white and had shed most of its powder on the shoulders of his frock coat. He was lit by the flames from tall iron cressets on poles on either side of him, while mounted on stone walls so dark they were almost black, were torches that shone with halos of pale light. Normally he stood relaxed, with his hands behind his back and leaning on his cane. But today there was a formal air about him. Mother? Yes, Hightam. She's ill, was my first thought, and I instantly felt a hot wave of guilt so intense I was almost giddy with it. I hadn't written to her in weeks. I'd hardly even thought about her. She's dead, Hightam, said Reginald, casting his eyes downward. A week ago she had a fall. Her back was badly hurt, and I'm afraid that she succumbed to her injuries. I looked at him. That intense rush of guilt was gone as quickly as it had arrived, and in its place an empty feeling, a hollow place where emotions should be. I'm sorry, Hightam. His weathered face creased into sympathy, and his eyes were kind. Your mother was a fine woman. That's quite all right, I said. We're to leave for England straight away. There's a memorial service. I see. If you need anything, then please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you. Your family is the Order now, Hightam. You can come to us for anything. Thank you. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. And if you need, to talk, then I'm here. I tried not to smile at the idea. Thank you, Reginald, but I won't need to talk. Very well. There was a long pause. He looked away. Is it done? Juan Vedomir is dead, if that's what you mean. And you have his journal? I'm afraid not. For a moment his face fell. Then it grew hard. Very hard. I'd seen his face do that before, in an unguarded moment. What? He said simply. I killed him for his betrayal of our cause, did I not? I said. Indeed, said Reginald carefully. Then what need did I have of his journal? It contains his writings. They are of interest to us. Why? I asked. Hightam, I had reason to believe that Juan Vedomir's treachery went beyond the matter of his adherence to the doctrine. I think he may have advanced to working with the assassins. Now tell me the truth, please. Do you have his journal? I pulled it from my bag, gave it to him, and he moved over to one of the candelabras, opened it, quickly flicked through, then snapped it shut. And have you read it? He asked. It's in code, I replied. But not all of it, he said equably. I nodded. Yes, you're right. There were some passages I was able to read. His thoughts on life. They made interesting reading. In fact, I was particularly intrigued, Reginald, by how much Juan Vedomir's philosophy was consistent with what my father once taught me. Quite possibly. And yet you had me kill him. I had you kill a traitor to the Order, which is something else entirely. Of course, I knew your father felt differently to me concerning many, perhaps even most, of the tenets of the Order, but that's because he didn't subscribe to them. The fact that he wasn't a Templar didn't make me respect him less. I looked at him. I wondered if I had been wrong to doubt him. Why, then, is the book of interest? Not for Vedomir's musings on life, that much is certain, smiled Reginald, and gave me a sideways smile. As you say, they were similar to your father's, and we both know our feelings about that. No, it's the coded passages I'm interested in, which, if I'm right, will contain details of the keeper of a key. A key to what? All in good time. I made a sound of frustration. Once I have decoded the journal, Hightam, he pressed, when, if I'm right, we'll be able to begin the next phase of the operation. And what might that be? He opened his mouth to speak, but I said the words for him. All in good time, Hightam, is that it? More secrets, Reginald? He bristled. Secrets? Really? Is that what you think? What exactly have I done to deserve your suspicion, Hightam, other than to take you under my wing, sponsor you in the Order, give you a life? You know, I might be forgiven for thinking you rather ungrateful at times, sir. We were never able to find Digweed, though, were we? I said, refusing to be cowed. There never was a ransom demand for Jenny, so the main purpose of the raid had to be Father's death. We hoped to find Digweed, Hightam. That's all we could ever do. We hoped to make him pay. That hope was not satisfied, but that doesn't mean we were derelict in our attempt. Moreover, I had a duty of care to you, Hightam, which was fulfilled. You stand before me a man, a respected knight of the Order. You overlook that, I think. And don't forget that I hoped to marry Jenny. Perhaps in the heat of your desire to avenge your father, you see losing Digweed as our only significant failure, but it's not, is it? Because we've never found Jenny, have we? Of course, you spare no thought for your sister's hardship. You accuse me of callousness, heartlessness. He shook his head. I merely request that you turn your stare on your own failings before you start shining light on mine. I looked carefully at him. You never took me into your confidence regarding the search. Braddock was sent to find him. He updated me regularly. But you didn't pass those updates to me. You were a young boy who grew up. He bent his head. Then I apologize for not taking that fact into account, Hightam. In future, I will treat you as an equal. Then start now. Start by telling me about the journal, I said. He laughed as though caught in check at chess. You win, Hightam. All right. It represents the first step towards the location of a temple, a first civilization temple thought to have been built by those who came before. There was a moment's pause in which I thought, is that it? Then laughed. At first he looked shocked, perhaps remembering the first time he'd ever told me about those who came before, when I'd found it difficult to contain myself. Those who came before what? I'd scoffed. Before us, he'd replied tightly. Before man. A previous civilization. He frowned at me now. You're still finding it amusing, Hightam? I shook my head. Not amusing so much, no. More, I struggled to find the words. Hard to fathom, Reginald. A race of beings who existed before man. Gods. Not gods, Hightam. First civilization humans who controlled humanity. They left us artifacts, Hightam, of immense power, such that we can only dream of. I believe that whoever can possess those artifacts can ultimately control all of human destiny. My laugh dwindled when I saw how serious he had become. It's a very grand claim, Reginald. Indeed. If it was a modest claim, then we would not be so interested, no? The assassins would not be interested. His eyes gleamed. The flames from the cressets shone and danced in them. I'd seen that look in his eyes before, but only on rare occasions. Not when he'd been tutoring me in languages, philosophy, or even in the classics or the principles of combat. Not even when he taught me the tenets of the Order. No, only when he talked about those who came before. Sometimes Reginald liked to deride what he saw as a surfeit of passion. He thought of it as a shortcoming. When he talked about the beings of the first civilization, however, he talked like a zealot. 2. We are staying the night in the Templar headquarters here in Prague. As I sit here now, in a meagre room with grey stone walls, I can feel the weight of thousands of years of Templar history upon me. My thoughts go to Queen Anne's Square, to which the household returned when the work was done. Mr. Simpkin had kept us abreast of developments. Reginald had overseen the building operation, even as we moved from country to country in search of Digweed and Jenny. And yes, Reginald was right. Failing to find Digweed, that fact eats at me. But I almost never think of Jenny. One day Simpkin sent us the word that the household had returned from Bloomsbury to Queen Anne's Square, that the household was once again in residence, back where it belonged. That day my mind went to the wood-panelled walls of the home I grew up in, and I found I could vividly picture the people within it, especially my mother. But of course, I was picturing the mother I had known growing up, who shone bright like the sun and twice as warm, on whose knee I knew perfect happiness. My love for father was fierce, perhaps stronger, but for mother it was purer. With father I had a feeling of awe, of admiration so grand I sometimes felt dwarfed by him, and with that came an underlying feeling I can only describe as anxiety, that somehow I had to live up to him, to grow into the huge shadow cast by him. With mother, though, there was no such insecurity, just the almost overwhelming sense of comfort and love and protection. And she was a beauty. I used to enjoy it when people compared me to father because he was so striking, but if they said I looked like mother, I knew they meant handsome. Of Jenny, people would say, she'll break a few hearts, she'll have men fighting over her. They applied the language of struggle and conflict, but not with mother. Her beauty was a gentle, maternal, nurturing thing, to be spoken of not with the wariness Jenny's looks inspired, but with warmth and admiration. Of course, I had never known Jenny's mother, Caroline Scott, but I had formed an opinion of her, that she was a Jenny, and that my father had been captivated by her looks just as Jenny's suitors were captivated by hers. Mother, though, I imagined to be an entirely different sort of person altogether. She was plain old Tessa Stevenson Oakley when she met my father. That's what she had always said, anyway, plain old Tessa Stevenson Oakley, which didn't sound at all plain to me, but never mind. Father had moved to London, arriving alone with no household, but a purse large enough to buy one. When he had rented a London home from a wealthy landowner, the daughter had offered to help my father find permanent accommodation, as well as employing the household to run it. The daughter, of course, was plain old Tessa Stevenson Oakley. She had all but hinted that her family wasn't happy about the liaison. Indeed, we never saw her side of the family. She devoted her energies to us, and until that dreadful night, the person who had her undivided attention, her unending affection, her unconditional love, was me. But the last time I had seen her, there was no sign of that person. When I think back to our final meeting now, what I remember is the suspicion in her eyes, which I realize was contempt. When I killed the man about to kill her, I changed in her eyes. I was no longer the boy who had sat on her knee. I was a killer.